Hello everyone. Our top global news and global analysis we have for the day. Let's begin. Global environment continues to be shaped by prolonged conflicts, strategic rivalries, and economic recalibration. Rather than sudden shocks, the world is experiencing sustained pressure across multiple regions where stability is managed but rarely achieved. In Eastern Europe, the conflict between Russia and Ukraine remains locked in a long war of attrition. The battlefield has evolved into dense network of trenches, defensive positions, drone surveillance, and artillery exchanges. Large territorial advances are limited, with both sides focusing on exhausting manpower, logistics, and morale. The conflict has reshaped regional security thinking across Europe, pushing governments to reassess military preparedness and long term defense spending. Across Europe, economic and political pressures are rising as governments balance support for Ukraine with domestic challenges. Inflation has eased from previous highs, but growth remains fragile, and public fatigue with prolonged conflict is becoming visible. Political debates increasingly revolve around sustainability, energy security, and social stability, reflecting the internal strain created by external conflict. In the Middle East, instability remains concentrated around the conflict involving Israel and Hamas. Military operations continue alongside diplomatic efforts aimed at preventing wider regional escalation. Qatar and Egypt play key mediation roles, particularly on ceasefire arrangements and humanitarian access. Beyond Gaza, the broader Middle East remains tense due to overlapping rivalries, proxy groups, and unresolved political disputes. Iran continues to project influence through regional partnerships, while Gulf states focus on internal economic transformation and strategic stability. The region is characterized by restraint mixed with constant risk, where escalation is avoided but never fully ruled out. In East Asia, strategic competition continues to intensify around Taiwan. China has increased military patrols and exercises in surrounding waters and airspace, signaling deterrence and asserting territorial claims. Regional countries closely monitor these developments, aware that miscalculation could have serious consequences for trade routes and regional security. The rivalry in East Asia extends beyond military matters into technology, manufacturing, and supply chains. Countries across Asia are diversifying trade partnerships, strengthening domestic industries, and reducing vulnerability to external disruptions. This reflects a broader shift towards economic resilience rather than pure efficiency. In South Asia, India continues to pursue strategic autonomy while engaging actively with regional and global partners. New Delhi remains focused on economic growth, infrastructure development, and regional connectivity while managing long standing border sensitivities. India's role in global forums reflect its ambition to act as bridge between developed and developing economies. Across Africa, political transitions, security challenges, and economic reforms continue to reshape the continent. Several countries are navigating post election adjustments, military led governments, and efforts to regain civilian control. Economic priorities focus on debt arrange management, infrastructure investment, and regional trade integration, particularly under African Continental Free Trade Area framework. In Latin America, governments face pressure from inflation, currency volatility, and social demands. Political polarization remains high in several countries, while regional cooperation on trade and migration remains uneven. Economic policy across the region reflects a balancing act between social spending and fiscal discipline. At the global level, institutions such as United Nations continue to call for diplomacy, humanitarian access, and conflict resolution. However, divisions among major powers limit collective action, highlighting the constraints of multilateral systems in a fragmented world. Overall, the global picture is defined by managed instability. Conflicts are contained but unresolved. Economies are adjusting rather than booming, and diplomacy is active but cautious. The current phase is not one of collapse but of slow realignment, where the direction of global order will be determined gradually through endurance rather than decisive moments. In North America, political, economic, and security developments continue to reshape the regional outlook, with United States, Canada, and Mexico each navigating distinct but interconnected challenges. In the United States, domestic politics remain highly polarized as the country moves closer to a crucial election period. Legal proceedings involving former President Donald Trump continue to dominate headlines, alongside debates over election integrity, judicial independence, and executive authority. These developments have intensified political divisions, influencing public discourse and policy priorities. On the economic front, the US economy shows mixed signals. Inflation has moderated compared to previous peaks, but concerns remain over high interest rates, household debts, and slowing consumer demand. The Federal Reserve has maintained a cautious stance, signaling that monetary policy decisions will depend heavily on incoming economic data. Markets remain sensitive to any indication of rate cuts or prolonged tightening. In terms of foreign and security policy, the United States continues to emphasize border enforcement and migration control. The situation along the southern border remains a major political issue, with federal authorities facing pressure from state governments and lawmakers to address migrant inflows, asylum processing delays, and border security infrastructure. In Canada, the government is grappling with economic affordability concerns, particularly related to housing, inflation, and cost of living. Rising housing prices in major cities have triggered political debate and public frustration, pushing the federal government to announce measures aimed at increasing housing supply and regulating short term rentals. Canada's political environment remains relatively stable, but public confidence has been tested by economic pressures and debates over immigration levels. While immigration remains central to Canada's labour market and population growth strategy, infrastructure and housing constraints have intensified scrutiny over current policies. In Mexico, security and governance remain key challenges. Organized crime and cartel related violence continue to affect several regions, influencing both domestic stability and cross border relations. Mexican government has increased security deployments in affected areas while balancing enforcement with social development initiatives. Mexico's economy remains closely linked to manufacturing and trade, particularly through supply chain integration with its northern neighbors. Nearshoring trends have brought increased foreign investment into industrial zones, especially in northern Mexico, boosting employment but also placing pressure on infrastructure, water resources, and local governance. Trilateral economic cooperation under USMCA framework continues to shape trade relations across North America. While trade volumes remain strong, disputes disputes persist over labor standards, energy policy, and regulatory alignment, reflecting underlying tensions in regional economic integration. Across the region, climate related issues are becoming more prominent. Extreme weather events, including heat waves, wildfires, and storms, have impacted infrastructure, agriculture, and public health. Governments are increasingly focused on disaster preparedness, energy transition, and climate resilience, though implementation remains uneven. Overall, North America is experiencing a phase of internal consolidation rather than external expansion. Political polarization, economic recalibration, and security challenges dominate the regional agenda, while governments focus on managing domestic pressures and preserving stability in a complex global environment. South America continues to navigate a complex phase marked by political transitions, economic adjustments, and shifting global relationships as governments balance domestic pressures with international realities. In Brazil, President remains focused on restoring Brazil's international standing while addressing domestic economic challenges. The government is pursuing environmental commitments, particularly in the Amazon, while also managing fiscal constraints and social spending priorities. Brazil's role as diplomatic bridge between developed and developing economies has gained renewed attention, especially in climate negotiations and South South cooperation. Economically, Brazil faces moderate growth with persistent concerns around public finances, inflation management, and investor confidence. Structural reforms remain politically sensitive, requiring careful negotiation with Congress and state governments. In Argentina, the economic situation remains highly fragile. President Javier Milei continues to push aggressive economic reforms aimed to stabilizing the currency, reducing subsidies, and controlling inflations. While international markets have reacted optimistic, cautiously optimistic to reform signals, the domestic population faces rising living costs, social protests, and uncertainty over employment and welfare support. Argentina's relationship with international financial institutions and creditors remains central to its economic survival, highlighting the country's vulnerability to global financial conditions. In Venezuela, political and economic tensions persist as the government of Nicolas Maduro seeks to consolidate power amid sanctions, relief discussions, and regional diplomacy. Oil production has shown limited recovery, but broader economic revival remains constrained, but infrastructure damage, capital shortages, and institutional weakness. Venezuela continues to be focal point in regional politics with migration flows affecting neighboring countries and shaping diplomatic engagement across the continent. In Colombia, the government under President Gustavo Petro is pursuing peace negotiation with armed groups while implementing social and environmental reforms. Security conditions remain uneven with progress in some regions offset by violence in others. Colombia's approach reflects a broader regional debate over security, development, and state authority. Across the continent, energy and resources remain central to South America's global relevance. Countries rich in oil, gas, lithium, and agricultural output continue to attract international interest, particularly as global supply chains diversify. Chile and Bolivia remain key players in lithium production, positioning the region within the global energy transition. Politically, South America remains ideologically diverse, with left leaning, right leaning, and centrist governments coexisting across the region. The diversity, the diversity has limited deep regional integration but allowed flexibility in external partnerships, including relations with Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. Social pressures remain a constant theme. Inflation, inequality, and public service delivery continue to test government's legitimacy. Street protests, labor actions, and political mobilization remain common tools of public expression, reflecting both democratic engagement and institutional stress. Overall, South America is navigating a period of adjustment rather than transformation. Governments are responding to economic constraints, global realignments, and domestic expectations simultaneously. The region's trajectory will depend less on ideology and more on its ability to deliver stability, growth, and social cohesion in an uncertain global environment. Europe continues to face sustained pressure from war, economic adjustment, and political realignment as leaders across the continent manage long term challenges rather than short term crises. After this, at the center of Europe's security and environment remains the war between Russia and Ukraine. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has repeatedly warned European governments that the conflict has entered a prolonged phase requiring predictable multi year military and financial support rather than short term emergency aid. Zelensky continues diplomatic engagements with European capitals to secure air defense systems, ammunition supplies, and economic assistance. With the European Union, Ursula von der Leyen has emphasized that support for Ukraine is not only a security issue but a test of Europe's political cohesion. The European Commission continues to coordinate sanctions policy, defense production planning, and financial assistance packages even as political fatigue grows among some member states. In Germany, German Chancellor faces mounting domestic pressure over weak economic growth, high energy costs, and defense spending commitments. German Chancellor has defended Germany's cautious but steady approach, stressing the need to avoid escalation while maintaining long term support for Ukraine. Germany's industrial slowdown has become a central issue in domestic political debate. In France, President Emmanuel Macron has argued that Europe must strengthen its strategic autonomy, including greater defense coordination and industrial capacity. Macron's push for stronger European security role has sparked debate among member states over the balance between national sovereignty and collective defense. In Italy, Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni continues to prioritize migration control and fiscal discipline. Italy has pressed for stronger European Union border management mechanisms, making migration one of the most politically sensitive issues shaping European negotiations. In the United Kingdom, Prime Minister Keir Starmer has focused on stabilizing the economy and restoring predictability in governance following political transition. The UK continues to play an active role in European security discussions while managing domestic priorities related to public services, growth, and post Brexit adjustment. Across Central and Eastern Europe, governments remain particularly focused on security risks. In Poland, Prime Minister Donald Tusk has reinforced Poland's strong support for Ukraine and emphasized increased defense readiness, reflecting the region's direct exposure to the conflict. On the economic front, Christine Lagarde, President of European Central Bank, has signaled caution as inflation pressures ease but economic growth remains weak. High interest rates continue to affect households, businesses, and government budgets, shaping political debate across the Eurozone. Migration remains a major political challenge across Europe, influencing elections and coalition politics. Governments are divided over asylum policy, border enforcement, and burden sharing, with public opinion increasingly shaping national positions within European institutions. Overall, Europe is navigating a period of strategic endurance. Decisions taken by political leaders today on security, economic policy, and migration will shape the continent's stability for years to come. Europe's future trajectory depends not on rhetoric but on whether the leaders can sustain cohesion under prolonged pressure. The Middle East remains one of the most sensitive regions globally, shaped by ongoing conflicts, regional rivalries, and domestic political pressures within key states. At the center of current instability in the war involving Israel and Hamas, Israel Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu continues to frame the conflict as a long term security operation, emphasizing military pressure on Hamas while facing growing domestic criticism over the duration of the war, hostage negotiations, and economic strain inside Israel. Within Israel, political divisions have deepened. Public protest and internal debate continues over government's handling of security, governance reforms, and civil military relations. The war has also placed sustained pressure on Israel's economy, reservist workforce, and international diplomatic standing. In Gaza, humanitarian conditions remain severe. While Hamas continues to operate militarily, its leadership structure has been significantly disrupted, and negotiations involving ceasefires and prisoner exchanges are handled through intermediaries rather than direct talks. Regional mediation efforts are led primarily by Qatar and Egypt. Qatar's Prime Minister and Foreign Minister Mohammed bin Abdul Rahman Al Thani has played a central diplomatic role in facilitating indirect negotiations, while Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el Sisi continues to focus on border security, humanitarian access, and preventing the conflict from spilling into Egypt. Beyond Gaza, regional tensions are shaped by Iran's strategic posture. In Iran, Supreme Leader Al Khamenei remains the central authority guiding Iran's regional policies. Following last year's political transition, following last year's political transition, President Massoud has taken office, with a focus on economic stabilization, while Iran continues to exert influence through allied groups across the region. In Lebanon, the presence of Hezbollah, led by Hassan Nasrallah, keeps the Israel Lebanon border under constant tension. Lebanon itself remains trapped in economic crisis with political paralysis and currency collapse continuing to affect daily life for citizens. In the Gulf, priorities remain focused on internal stability and economic diversification. Saudi Arabia under Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman continues to pursue large scale economic transformation while maintaining a cautious regional posture, balancing diplomatic engagement with security concerns. In Yemen, the conflict remains unresolved. The Houthis, led by Abdul Malik al Houthi, continue to exert a control over significant territory, while Yemen's humanitarian crisis persists amid stalled political negotiations. In Syria, President Bashar al Assad has consolidated control over much of the country, but Syria remains economically devastated and diplomatically isolated, despite gradual re-engagement with some regional key states. Overall, Middle East is characterized by contained conflict rather than resolution. Governments are prioritizing regime stability, security management, and economic survival over transformative political settlements. Regional escalation is being avoided through diplomacy and deterrence, but underlying tensions remain unresolved, making the region highly sensitive to miscalculation. Africa continues to face convergence of security challenges, political transitions, and economic pressures, with developments in several key countries shaping with regional and global responses. In Sudan, the civil war between rival military factions remain one of the most severe crises on the continent. Fighting between forces loyal to Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, head of Sudanese armed forces, and those aligned to Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, commonly known as Hamditi, has devastated civilian infrastructure and displaced millions. International mediation efforts have so far failed to produce a durable ceasefire, while humanitarian conditions continue to deteriorate. In Ethiopia, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed remains focused on post-conflict stabilization following the Tigray War, while managing ethnic tensions and economic reforms. Ethiopia's role as strategic partner in the Horn of Africa gives its importance beyond its border, particularly in relation to Red Sea security and regional trade routes. In Nigeria, Africa, Africa's largest economy, President Tinubu continues to implement economic reforms, including subsidy removal and currency adjustments. These policies aim to stabilize public finances but have triggered public dissatisfaction due to rising living costs. Security challenges persist, with insurgency in the northeast and banditry and in other regions remaining unresolved. In South Africa, President Cyril Ramaphosa is navigating economic stagnation, energy shortages, and political competition. Power supply issues and infrastructure constraints continue to weigh on growth, while South Africa maintains an active diplomatic role through BRICS and African multilateral forums. In the Sahel region, military led governments in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger have distanced themselves from Western partners while deepening security cooperation among themselves. These governments have emphasized sovereignty and counterinsurgency, while international actors remain concerned about governance, human rights, and long-term stability. In Democratic Republic of Congo, President Felix faces ongoing insecurity in the eastern regions where armed groups continue to operate despite regional diplomatic efforts. The conflict has drawn in neighboring countries diplomatically, reflecting the complexity of Central African security dynamics. Economically, Africa remains central to global discussions on critical minerals, including cobalt, lithium, and rare earths. Countries such as Democratic Republic of Congo and Zambia are increasingly significant to global supply chains linked to electric vehicles and renewable energy, attracting strategic interest from major powers. Across the continent, international institutions continue to engage with African governments on debt restructuring, development financing, and climate resilience. While growth prospects vary widely by country, the underlying challenges of governance, security, and economic inclusion remain central to Africa's trajectory. Overall, Africa's current landscape is defined by internal consolidation rather than transformation. Leadership decisions, security outcomes, and economic reform choices made now will shape the continent's stability and global relevance in the coming years. Far East Asia remains one of the most strategically sensitive regions globally, shaped by power, competition, security tensions, and economic interdependence. Developments here have direct consequences for global trade, military balance, and diplomatic alignment. In China, President Xi Jinping continues to consolidate political authority while steering the country through economic headwinds. China's leadership is focused on maintaining internal stability and slowing growth, property sector stress, and declining foreign investment sentiment. At the same time, Beijing remains assertive in regional affairs, emphasizing national security, technological self reliance, and long term strategic competition with the United States. China's stance on Taiwan remains unchanged at the strategic level. Beijing continues to describe reunification as historical objective while using military pressure, diplomatic isolation, and economic signaling rather than direct confrontation. Large scale military drills around Taiwan have become more frequent, serving as deterrence and messaging rather than preparation for immediate conflict. In Taiwan, Taiwanese president has taken office following elections, inheriting a complex security environment. The Taiwanese government continues to strengthen defense preparedness and international partnerships while carefully managing relations with Beijing to avoid escalation. Taiwan's semiconductor industry remains central to its global relevance and strategic value. In Japan, Japanese Prime Minister continues to push defense reforms, including increased military spending and closer coordination with allies. Japan's leadership has framed these moves as necessary responses to regional security risks, particularly related to China and North Korea. Domestically, Japan also faces long-term challenges including population decline, public debt, and economic revitalization. In South Korean president has emphasized stronger security alignment with the United States and Japan. South Korea's foreign policy focus remains on deterrence against North Korea, while domestically the government faces political polarization and economic pressures related to exports and global demand. In North Korea, leader Kim Jong-un continues to prioritize weapons development as core national strategy. Missile tests and military demonstrations remain central tools for signaling strength and extracting concessions. North Korea's actions are closely monitored by regional governments given the risk of miscalculation and escalation. Relations between Koreas remain frozen with no meaningful dialogue underway. The Korean Peninsula continues to be one of the most heavily militarized regions in the world, with stability maintained through deterrence rather than reconciliation. Across Far East Asia, economic interdependence coexists with strategic rivalry. Supply chains, technology competition, and trade remain deeply interconnected even as governments pursue diversification and resilient strategies. The region's stability depends on managing competition without allowing to it to slide into open conflict. Overall, Far East Asia is characterized by controlled tension rather than resolution. Leadership decisions in Beijing, Tokyo, Seoul, Pyongyang, and Taipei will continue to shape not only regional outcomes but also broader global balance of power. Southeast Asia continues to play a critical role in global geopolitics and trade position between major power competition and its domestic political and economic transitions. In Indonesia, Indonesian president has taken office following elections marking a significant political transition. Prabowo's administration has emphasized continuity in economic development while signaling a strong focus on national security and defense modernization. Indonesia remains central to Asian diplomacy and global supply chains, particularly in minerals critical to electric vehicle production. In Singapore, S- Singa, Prime Minister of Singapore continues to guide the city state through economic uncertainty and regional instability. Singapore remains focused on maintaining its position as financial and logistics hub while balancing relations between the United States and China amid growing strategic rivalry. In Philippines, the Filipino president has strengthened defense cooperation with United States in response to rising tensions in the South China Sea. Domestically, the government is also dealing with inflation pressures, infrastructure development, and disaster resilience, given the country's exposure to climate risks. In Vietnam, political authorities remain concentrated within the Communist Party president. The president oversees state affairs while Prime Minister of Vietnam focuses on economic management and foreign investment. Vietnam continues to attract global manufacturing as companies diversify supply chains away from China. In Thailand, Thailand Prime Minister leads government navigating political polarization and economic recovery. Thailand's domestic politics remain sensitive with long-standing divisions influencing governance while tourism and exports remain vital to economic stability. In Malaysia, Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim continues to pursue governance reforms and economic restructuring. Malaysia seeks to balance domestic political consensus with regional and global economic engagement, particularly in technology and manufacturing sector. Across Southeast Asia, Association of South Asian nations remain central to regional diplomacy. However, Asian unity continues to be tested by differing national interests, particularly on issues such as South China Sea, Myanmar's political crisis, and relations with major powers. In Myanmar, the internal conflict persists under military rule. The situation remains a major humanitarian and diplomatic challenge for the region, with Asians' mediation efforts yielding limited progress. Overall, Southeast Asia is characterized by strategic balancing rather than alignment. Governments are focused for protecting economic growth, managing domestic political stability, and avoiding entanglement in great power conflict, while quietly strengthening national resilience and regional cooperations. South Asia remains a region of high strategic importance shaped by population scale, regional rivalries, domestic political transitions, and growing global engagement. Developments here continue to affect security, trade, and diplomacy beyond the region. In India, Prime Minister Narendra Modi continues to focus on economic growth, infrastructure expansion, and India's positioning as major global power. Domestically, the government emphasizes manufacturing, digital governance, and strategic autonomy, while internationally, India remains active in forums such as G20, BRICS, and the Quad. India's foreign policy reflects a balance between engagement with the West and maintaining strategic independence. In Pakistan, Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif is dealing with severe economic pressures, including inflation, debt servicing, and negotiation with internal finance institutions. Pakistan's political environment remains fragile with civil-military relations and internal security challenges continuing to influence governance and regional stability. Relations between India and Pakistan remain tense with limited diplomatic engagement. Cross-border security concerns and historical disputes continue to define bilateral relations, keeping South Asia geopolitically sensitive. In Bangladesh, political dominance while facing growing economic and social pressures. Bangladesh continues to be an important manufacturing hub, particularly in textiles, but concerns around labor conditions, inflation, and political freedoms remain part of domestic and international discussions. In Sri Lanka, Sri Lankan president continues efforts to stabilize the economy following the country's financial collapse. Structural reforms, debt restructuring, and engagement with international lenders remain central to Sri Lanka's recovery, while public trust in political institutions is still being rebuilt. In Nepal, Nepalese Prime Minister is also known as Prachanda, leads a fragile coalition government. Nepal continues to manage internal political instability while balancing relation with its two powerful neighbors, India and China. In Afghanistan, Taliban leadership remains in control as the central authority. Afghanistan remains largely isolated internationally, facing severe economic hardship, humanitarian challenges, and restrictions on social freedom, particularly affecting women and girls. Across South Asia, economic pressures, population growth, climate vulnerability, and governance challenges intersect with long standing political rivalries. Regional cooperation remains limited, while bilateral and multilateral engagements continue to shape the region's interaction with global powers. Overall, South Asia is characterized by internal cost consolidation and cautious external engagement. Leadership decisions taken within the region will play a critical role in shaping economic resilience, political stability, and long term regional security. Australia and New Zealand continue to position themselves as stable democratic partners in the Indo Pacific, balancing domestic economic priorities and growing regional security responsibilities. In Australia, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese remains focused on economic mismanagement, energy transitions, and strengthening Australia's role in regional security framework. Domestically, the Albanese government continues to address cost of living pressures, house affordability, and infrastructure investment while pursuing climate policy reforms aimed at reducing emissions and expanding renewable energy. On the international front, Australia has deepened defense and strategic cooperation with key partners, particularly through alliances and regional groupings focused on Indo Pacific stability. Canberra's foreign policy emphasizes deterrence, supply chain resilience, and maritime security, reflecting concerns over regional power competition and freedom of navigation. Australia's defense modernization and increased security engagement have also influenced domestic debate, with discussions around military spending, industrial capacity, and long term strategic autonomy gaining prominence. In New Zealand, New Zealand's Prime Minister leads a government focused on economic discipline, inflation control, and restoring fiscal balance. The Luxon administration have prioritized reducing public spending growth while encouraging private sector investment and productivity. Domestically, New Zealand continues to face challenges related to housing affordability, public services, and economic growth. The government has signaled a pragmatic approach to governance, emphasizing efficiency and economic stability over expansive social programs. In foreign policy, New Zealand maintains a cautious and balanced posture while remaining aligned with traditional partners. Wellington continues to emphasize diplomacy, multilateralism, and regional cooperation, particularly in the Pacific Islands. Climate change, disaster resilience, and development assistance remains central to New Zealand's regional engagement. Both Australia and New Zealand remain actively involved in Pacific affairs, where competition for influence has increased in recent years. Their engagement focuses on infrastructure support, economic development, and security cooperation, reflecting the strategic importance of the Pacific region. Overall, Australia and New Zealand are navigating a period of major strategic engagement. Their leadership aim to preserve domestic stability while adapting to more contested regional environment, balancing economic priorities with long-term security considerations. That's our news for the day on global analysis. Thank you for tuning in with us. Have a great time.